Hey everyone, welcome back to my channel, and this is the another video wherein we are going to discuss a new topic in Java which is called as enumeration. So enumeration is something quite interesting, and I would say it's quite important as well in big projects. We definitely tend to use that. So in this video we're going to be discussing enumerations, or you can short and say enum. We're going to be discussing enum in detail, and we're going to be looking at different aspects. So we're going to be proceeding first by just step by step, and initially we're going to be looking at the definition of enum, that what exactly enum is and why do we exactly need, why there was a need of enum, because it's a combination of arrays and class. So we already have arrays and classes, and we can use that in a proper way. We have so much of the functionalities of arrays and classes. So why there was a need of having creating something called as enum. So we're going to be discussing everything in detail. So let's try to analyze first of all that what exactly the definition is saying, and basis on that we're going to be working towards it. We'll be looking at certain examples of it, and we're going to be discussing everything in detail about it. So enumeration, or you can short and say enum, basically the word enum is saying that specifically listed. When you have something specifically listed, it's called as enumerations. And talking about enum in Java is a data type which stores a set of constant values. So yes, talking about enum is something you require it when you need certain types of the constants. So in Java, basically you have one way to define constants. You can put the keyword as final, because when you use a keyword final with certain kind of a variable or method or with a class, it has a different meaning. I mean, it just make it as a constant, right? Talking about the variable, when you make it as constant, you just have to use the final keyword, and you cannot change that value, because that's going to be the final value of that particular variable, and that actually makes it constant. But talking about enumeration has certain different functionalities, and which we're going to be discussing in detail, that how we can use that. But talking about this, it actually stores the constant values. You can just have a list of constant values. I will be discussing just a small case where exactly do we use that. So you can use enumeration to store fixed values such as days in a week or months in a year. So because talking about the weekdays, or talking about the month, it's going to be something which is constant, right? You don't have to have that particular thing gonna get changed. That something is not gonna get changed inside of your code. That's gonna be something which is constant, right? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday is gonna be something constant, and you're gonna be using that repeatedly, right? So that's the reason you want to keep it as constant, and you can define it inside of the enumeration. So that's where you use enumerations. And let's discuss about the second definition, which it is saying. So enum can, just like as a class, have attributes and methods. So like I mentioned, that enum is basically a combination of arrays. So it's not like that you're gonna be having all the properties of the class or of the arrays inside the enum. There are it's kind of a combination of that, of these two. So some of the properties and some of the things are from captured from the classes, and some of the things are from the arrays. So it's basically a combination of these two, and it is possessing certain qualities of both of of each of the things. So the only difference is that enum constants are public. Yes, it's public. You can define it inside of the class, or you can define it outside of the class, and based on that you can use it. And it's static, final, unchangeable, cannot be overridden. Yes, that is something which is going to be a constant, so that means you cannot change that. So enum constant cannot be used to create objects. So unlike classes, when we create the object of a class, we can definitely create the objects of a class. But talking about enum, it can also be used as a class, but you cannot use the object of that. We'll see how it's going to work. I mean, we will try to create the object, and we will see what kind of the error that we get. And it cannot extend other classes, but it can implement the interface. So that is something going to be like a little extra. But in this video we're going to be trying to cover up many of the things, but we'll definitely see what's going to happen. So basis upon that, let's come back to the screen, and we will try to work on the project. So yeah, first of all, let's see why do we need enums, right? So enum is basically the combination of arrays and class. So let's try to define an array and see what kind of a problem that we get, right? So inside of the main class, right, inside of the main method, if I'll try to just create a string, let's suppose I'm creating a string over here, and I will call this as str just to make it simple, and I will be calling it as array, right? So let's try to define certain things. So let's suppose if you're defining just to take the same example, January, I will keep it as February, and the next which I want to keep it as March, right? And so on. I can also take it as one more. So let's suppose if we are having these four, values inside of a string, right? And I know that, this is something which is going to be fixed. That is something not going to get changed, right? And I'm working on a very big project. Let's say I'm working on a very big project and I'm going to be using that repeatedly. And let's suppose I'm going to be writing a code of supposedly, the thousand lines. So in that particular case, just imagine for a fact that at the 1,000th line, I will have to keep this thing in my mind that what's going to be the index of January and of the February, because let's suppose I'm on the 1,000th line, right? And over here I just want to compare the value of the string which is at the index, right? Which is at the index, let's say 1, and by mistake I just put something else, right? That's going to lead to some kind of an error, and that's also going to lead to a lot of chaos, because every time I will have to use this particular string with that particular value, I will have to just keep on these thing repeatedly, have to use this particular thing, I have to use the index number, and that may lead to some kind of an error, because I know that this is going to be a constant, and but at the same time, this is something going to lead to a lot of chaos because I have to use the array. And supposingly, like, there is also one more case. As of now, I'm inside of the main method, and let's suppose I'm going to be creating certain more classes, right? I will be having multiple, like as 10, 20 classes inside of my project. And in that project, let's suppose if I want to use this particular string in the other class, then I will have to create the object, and basis on that I will have to call this particular string. That's going to lead to a lot of problem, because that is something we don't want, and we just want to work on a constant, and this much of the chaos, it's not something which is going to be fruitful for our project. So we have another method. Let's suppose I'm just giving an example. So I'm working on a project which is called as, just to make it simple, I'm working on a project which is related to a stock exchange, right? Stock exchange, and I'm creating a game, right, related to the stock exchange. So in that particular game, and my user is gonna play and just take some trades inside of that application. So whenever the user is going to be taking the trades on the daily basis, there will be different outputs that's going to happen. There will be certain different notification that's going to come. Let's suppose for a given day the user is going to have the output as profit, because that's what happens. We have only 3 different cases inside of a trading system. Either the user can have a profit, or it can have a loss, or maybe the user is gonna on a specific day not gonna go for any kind of a trade. So let's just try to define the enum first, and basis on that we're gonna be discussing it further. So I will call this as result, just to keep it simple, because this is gonna be the result of my trade, right? So this is how the enum is basically created. So just you have to use the keyword as enum and have to specify the name of the enum that you want, just like the way you define a class. So as you can see, that public class enum demo, that's how we define the class. And enum is quite similar to class, but it has certain limited functionalities. So that's how you define the enum. So enum is going to be my result. So what I want to define is 3 different types of the constants. So I can have a profit, because this is something called as a we call this as a constant. So that's the reason Java says as a standardization to keep it as uppercases. So I'll just keep it as uppercases. But yes, I just wanted to show you that you can also keep it as lower cases. But to make a difference, you have to use this as something called as in the upper cases. And there is an optional thing which you have. So you can either put a semicolon right after the end of the constants definition, or you can just leave it as it is. But let's suppose if you're if you want to define certain more things after your constants, then you can just put the semicolon. It's better to use a semicolon at the end. So that's what I wanted to mention over here. And so now that we have defined our constants, and that's pretty simple, right? Just imagine for a fact the previous case when we were trying to create the string, and basis on that we have so much of the index numbers that we have to keep a note of, and basis on that we have to use. But as of now, just a simple thing, define an enum and just mention your constants that you want to make. So as of now, like I mentioned, that I was making an application, and basis on that I was trying to get the different types of the outputs, right? So you can see that basically now that we have okay, so now that we have already defined our constants and I want to use them, right? So my user is going to be either having profit, loss, or no trade, and basis on that I just want to just print the things, right? So what's going to happen? So let's try to, execute this particular thing, right? And I'm coming back to my main method. And if I want to specify, I want to use a specific constant, then how can I do that? So basically, in order to use a specific constant, you just have to name whatever the name of your enum is. This is the name of my enum, which is result. And whenever I just put this particular dot, it's giving me the option that what I want to use. It's giving me the option to specifically choose from the constants that I've created. I can use loss, no trade, profit, and these are the other methods, because we can also create the methods inside of the enum. So we will see how we can do that. But as of now, I just want to use the profit, right? That's going to be pretty much simple. So that's how I can just specifically take a constant from the enum. So let's try to execute the code and see the output, right? So the output that I'm going to be getting is profit. Pretty much simple, right? That's perfectly cool. So now, right, as of now, we have understood that enum cannot have the objects. But talking about the constants, right, that we have inside of the enum, we can definitely create certain objects. We have certain kind of a functionality that gives us the access to create the objects for a constant. So let's try to do that. So basically, this is basically the first way. Let me just put this in the comments. So just to make you simple, this is basically the first way. This is basically the first way to, just call a particular constant from the enum. And the next you can do is that you can create an object. So how do you define an object? So let's suppose I'm just keeping it as result, the name of my enum, and I'm just keeping it as L. That's what I want to use as the object. And the next thing I want to do is that I want to use the specific constant which I want to use. So now again, I'm just putting the dot. I can either I can either choose loss, no trade, or profit, but I want to keep it short as L for the loss. So I'm going to be keeping it as loss, right? So that's how we can also create the object. So this is a little bit of something tricky, right? Because we cannot create the objects for the methods, but we can create the object. It's not actually the same object like the way we create in the classes, but it is sort of an object that you can say, right? So this is basically the second way which I'm going to be, this is the second way which I'm telling you in order to specify a constant and use a specific constant from the enum. So this time, how you can basically, you can use this L at any point of time, right? You can use this as L at any point of time. You can just simply put as L inside of your system.out.println, and basis on that, you can execute your code and you will see the amazing thing over here, which is going to print your output as loss. So that's pretty much simple, right? I mean, we have two different ways to call out the constants, and basis on that, you can work in a pretty cool way. So now that we have seen that we have defined the constant, and now let's try to proceed further, and basis on that, we're going to be, just calling the methods. Now let's try to define the methods inside of the enum. So how can we do that? So basically, so let me do one thing over here. I haven't mentioned this thing. So basically, as of now, we have mentioned this enum outside of the class, right? This is just one way. We can also define this enum inside of the class. The benefit of defining enum outside of the class is that, let's suppose if you're working on a big project and you have so many classes working on which you're working, right? So on all classes, you want to just keep this thing as simple and, in a concise way. You want to use in all of your classes. So that's the reason it's better to mention it outside of the class, so that you don't have to specifically, worry about in other classes, because we're going to be using this thing in all the classes. So that's the reason I'm keeping it outside of the class. But yes, if you're sure of that, you just want to use it in a specific class, then you can define your enum inside of this class only, right? That's pretty much going to be cool. And let's try to just put this inside of this class. It's not going to give us any kind of an error, but at the same time, I'm just keeping it as outside of the class, so as to just make it simple. So now that we have, worked on the constant, so let's try to, define certain methods. So I'm going to be creating a method over here, which is called as crypto, right? So I'm just going to be keeping it as simple. So let's define this particular, we can say crypto is risky, right? So this is the method which we have defined inside of the enum. So just to make a difference over here, just to let you know that what's the difference that we have when we create a method inside of a class or inside of an enum, right? So there must have been some sort of a difference, because this is enum, this is basically used to create the constants. So because we know that we cannot create the objects of the enum, so how we can call this particular method? So in order to call this method, I need to do some certain things. So first of all, I will have to use this result as the name of my enum. So now it's gonna give me okay. So this is basically, what's the name of a method? It's crypto, right? Okay, so in order to call this particular method, I can just simply type it as crypto, right? You can see that it's giving me the error, right? Why exactly it is giving me the error? Let's suppose if I'm just removing this result from here, because we cannot create the objects for the method, right? So how we can define this, how we can just call this particular crypto method? It's not possible just to mention crypto and boom, you're going to be calling that method. That's not going to happen, because we cannot create the object, so we need to have certain syntax. So what we can do is that we can use the keyword, you can use the name of the enum that we have as dot, right? And based on that, we can try to call it. But again, we are getting the error because we are right now inside of the static method. And in order to call something which is, in order to call a method which is inside of a static method, then we need to have that method as well static, so that we don't get any kind of an error and it's not going to mess up with our system. So now that you can see that it's, error free and we can call this particular method, let's try to execute the code and we will see the difference. Right, so it's saying crypto is risky. Definitely it's calling this particular method inside of the static method, which is our main method, right? That's pretty much cool, right? Now what we want to do, we want to call this method in a different way, because we cannot create the object, but at the same time we have created an object over here. So let's try to use this particular L as a reference to call this method. So how can we do that? So what we can do is that we can use L dot crypto, and yes, we can definitely call this method in this way as well. Let's try to execute this code and see the output. So it's going to be calling the crypto is risky as 2 times, right? It's going to be calling this method for 2 times. So we can also use the reference which we create for the constant as a reference to call the methods which is inside of the enum. That's the another way. So we have seen that 2 ways to call the constants, 2 ways to call the method. So that's pretty much simple, right? And that's pretty much cool. So yeah, as of now, we have discussed about the methods and also about the constants. So what is left? Now we're going to be looking at different functionality, and that is something quite an important one. You just need to understand how it is happening, why it is happening. So basically you can see that, these are the constants that we have defined. So as of now, we have understood that enum cannot have the objects, right? So what we can have, so basically what we can do is that we can use these constants. These constants are something which is going to be helpful in order to call the constructors. So let's try to define a constructor and see what's basically is happening. So the name of the enum is result, right? So we can create a method which is going to be result, right? And that's going to be our constructor. So inside of the constructor, what we can do is that I'm going to be just printing a very simple message just to show you the demonstration. I am in the constructor of enum, right? So that's what I wanted to print. So basically what's going to happen, as you can see that, let's try to understand how we can call this constructor and how exactly this constructor is going to be called. So basically, now that we have understood there is no object creation for an enum, so we need to understand that how exactly this constructor is going to be called. So basically, let's try to remove everything, because we have understood this particular part of the code and we don't need to have this thing. Okay, so let me just keep this thing over here, right? So now we are in the main method once again back, and we need to understand how this constructor is going to be called. So in order to call this constructor, every time we are basically, just loading the enum class, as you can see that system.out.println is having a constant called inside of the enum. So this means it's going to just go to the enum class. It's going to be just pointing the system towards this particular point. It's going to be loading the enum class. Whenever there is an enum class which is loaded, it's going to be calling the constructor of that particular enum. and how many times it's going to be calling the constructor of that particular enum, just like as the same number of the constants that we have. So basically we can say that enum constants calling the enum constructors. So whenever there is a constant, there is a constant which is going to be called, right? As you can see that this time we are just calling this particular constant. So that means it's going to be, just loading the enum class, and that's where it's going to be pointing towards the constructor of that enum. So that's what basically happens, and that's what's going to happen. And you will see that it's going to be calling the constructor for 3 different times. Let me just execute this code. All right. So basically, as soon as I just load this enum class, it's before printing out this particular thing, it's calling the constructor, because the constructor is something which is called before at the very first time, right? I mean, just don't care about any other execution. It just simply go for the execution. So now imagine for a fact I will try to execute this particular thing once again. All right. So let's see at that point in time what's going to happen. So this time I'm going to be printing something else. Let's print out the loss, and let's try to run the code, and we will see the difference. So basically there is a difference, right? It has called the constructor only for 3 times instead of like for 6 times. The reason is very simple. In normal classes, when we create the object, every time we create the object, the constructor is called, right? Doesn't matter like how many times you create the object, it's going to be calling the constructor that many times. But over here the scenario is different, because we are trying to print the constant of the enum, right? But it is just loading the enum class, so it's basically calling the constructor at the very first point when the enum class is loaded. So that means at the very first instance when the enum class is loaded, it's going to be printing out the constructor. It's going to be pointing to the constructor, which is result, and it's going to be printing the message of the constructor that I am in the constructor of enum. So that's what basically is happening. It's not basically because the enum class has been loaded at this point in time. So this time it's just printing the message as loss. That's pretty much it, right? That's the main point which I wanted to mention over here. So now that we have understood how exactly the constructor inside of an enum class is working, and now what we can do. So now basically, as we have understood about the constructor which is having no parameters, so let's just imagine for a fact I'm having one more constructor which is basically having certain parameters passed. So I'll just name this as result, and let's call it as string, right? So now I'm just trying to pass on certain parameters over here. So let's see what's the difference gonna make. So this time I will be just this is a new constructor with parameters. I will just keep it as simple, and I also want to print this particular string which we have. So let's see what's going to happen. So basically as of now, so try to understand one thing over here, because right now my constants are just simply constants, right? It's not basically having any kind of an argument which will be passed. So every constant is basically calling a constructor. So it's basically calling the constructor having no parameters. So now imagine for a fact if I'll just pass on certain parameters, and I will be passing certain parameters. This is profit, and for the other constant I'm just passing on, let's just try to just keep it as simple. Just for the instance, I'm just having one single parameter which will be passed to one constant, right? So let's try to execute this code, and we will see the difference, right? So what's going to happen? What do you think? It's going to be executing the code properly, and it's going to be calling the constructor. Okay, let me just put certain space over here, and in order to show you this properly. Okay, so yeah, basically what is happening over here, let's try to understand the code now. So we have 2 different constructor inside of the enum class. One is having no parameters, and one is having one single parameter passed to it. So basically when I'm trying to load the enum class, when I'm trying to just execute this thing result.profit, it's referring to these constants which we have created. But at the same time, we can see that the constants which we have created is just one single constant is having some parameters passed. So basically it's going to be trying to find out the constructor which is having some parameters passed. So it's going to be pointing to this particular constructor instead of this particular constructor. So that's the reason it's going to be executing this particular constructor with this particular message, right? This is a new constructor, and having certain parameters. This is a profit, right? This is something which is going to print, and at the same time we have two different constants which is going to be pointing out to the constructor having no parameters. So that's going to be just pointing to this particular constructor. So that's what is happening over here, and that's what we need to understand, that the constant are something which points to the constructor, and basis upon the parameters passed, it's going to be just taking the reference of that one, right? That's what the point that we need to keep a note of. And yes, second time it's not just calling out any of the constructor. The reason is simple, because enum constructors are called only at that point when the enum class is loaded for the very first time. So that's what it is happening, and it's not just pointing out to any of the constructor. So yeah, as of now we have understood everything about enum constants, enum methods, how these are basically called, and also about the constructor with parameters, without parameters. So for this video we are only left with the last thing, and I will be just quickly showing you that. So I hope you must have the understanding about the for loops, talking about specifically for each loop, because that is something which you're going to be seeing in this video, that how we can work with for each loops using the enums. So enums is basically having a different way to use for each loops. So that's what we're going to be using in this video. So basically you can see that we have three different constants, right? Three different constants, and let's try to execute the for each loop for that. So how can we do that? So basically what's the name of my enum is a result, and I will be creating a reference variable for that, which is res. So I need to I need to use all the values which we have. I want to print out and I want to point out all the values which are inside of the enum. So what we can do is that we just need to use result. That's the name of my enum. I will put a dot over here. So it's going to be giving me the option that which constant you want to use, or if you want to just specifically call a specific method. So what I'm going to be doing is that I'm going to be using a default method which we have in Java, which is values, dot values. This particular values is going to be referring to all the constants that we have inside of the enum. So what I want to do is that I want to just print this particular thing, that it should be printing all the constants that we have. So I'll just put this res, and let's try to execute the code and see the difference. Okay, I guess there is some problem. Yeah, so basically what is happening over here, it's just calling out the constructors as well. So let me just remove the constructors first, and basis on that we will try to understand what is going on, because the constructors are basically messing up with the result that we want, and that's the reason it's hard to understand what's going on inside of the code. So let me just remove these constructors, and basis on that we will try to understand from the code. So yeah, you can see the error that we are getting, because the profit which we have mentioned over here, as now that we have removed the constructor, so it's not able to pass on the the message that it is having, right? So let me just remove that part as well from the code, and then we will try to run the code. So you will see all of the constants that's going to be printed in this particular code: profit, loss, no trade. Because what's happening inside of the for each loop, when we create the reference variable, it basically just like the array works, it just take all the values of the array, and basis on that it prints out that. So that's what it is happening. I'm using the reference variable res, and using the default method which we have dot values, it's pointing to all the constants that we have inside of the enum, printing all those values. So yeah, that's pretty much it, and I hope I was able to explain you the for each loop as well. So for each loop is just nothing, and it's pretty simple. So now that we have discussed everything about enums, we have discussed about the constant creation, calling those constants, creating the methods inside of the enum, calling those methods, and talking about the constructor. How do we create constructors? What are the properties, and how do we define that? Talking about the for each loop is also something which we have discussed in this particular video. And the next thing we need to understand, where do we use these enums. So enums are basically quite helpful when you use switch cases, because you just have to create a reference variable, or you can just define the constants, and basis on that you can, use that in switch cases using those if conditions. So that's pretty much cool, right? Over there as well you can use that. I won't be discussing that part because it's going to be quite simple. If you have understood how do you create the constants inside of the enum, that's going to be quite easy for you just to create the codes for that switch cases. If you find out any kind of a trouble, you can just mention that in the comment box. I will definitely try to answer that. So yeah, that's pretty much it in this video. As yes, the video has become quite very long, but I was trying to explain you everything in detail about the enums, because that's what happened. That's what happened with me as well, because when I was trying to learn the enum, that's what happened. There was no proper guidance that I was able to take the reference from. I had to learn the enum trying different things. So yeah, I just wanted to cover that part in a single video, so as to make the things easy for you, and you can use this video as a reference, and basis on that you can try to learn the different things about the enum. So yeah, that's pretty much it from my side. Thanks for your time. See you next time.